We have a speaker who's going to speak for 30 to 35 minutes on the topic of gangs and youth violence. The speaker is Joe Cardwell, who is a long-standing member of the SWP, also a youth justice worker, and currently in Islington branch SWP. Joe's going to speak for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and contributions after that.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay. Well, I think there's been, and I should imagine people are here because there's been a whole number of headlines and news really about the question of youth violence. I mean, I have some pages here: weekend of knife carnage from the Evening Standard, weekend of knife mayhem, just to give you a couple of examples. I think it was probably only until very recently, when we had the general election and of course the tragedy in Grenfell actually, that overtook and that actually pushed and relegated the knife crime headlines into the back pages. But still, last week on the Evening Standard, we have an announcement that Neville Lawrence, the father of Stephen Lawrence, is going to be involved in a new task force that is going to be looking at how we deal with the question of knife crime. And the Evening Standard in the same article talked about a figure of so far this year of 24 young people under the age of 25 that have been fatally stabbed, 10 of those being teenagers. And I suppose really, I think it's important to distinguish between how the tabloids report this, which I think actually is, there's a level of sensationalism, of course, as to tabloid journalism, which I think we need to try and to look at and try and understand. There's also talk, of course, in the tabloid press about young people being feral, being wild, being animals, and almost talk about this as almost if it's just this unexplainable phenomenon. We can't really see where this has come from. How can we possibly understand what's taking place out of there? And of course, if you can't really understand something, then the only response you can have to it really is to be fearful of it, and also to try and call for things like tougher sentencing, increased policing, and so on. And I really want to try and look at some of those calls. In fact, it's only recently actually that we've had the introduction of a new set of sentencing guidelines, mandatory sentencing for 16 and 17-year-olds. Is this getting feedback on this, or is this you hearing it right? It's just me. Yeah, they've been calling for tougher sentencing, and in actual fact, we've seen the first increase in youth custody figures for 9 years inside the UK, most of that being down to the new sentencing laws around knives. And I want to go and look later on at the question around youth detention and youth custody later, and to see whether or not it's an option that we should be looking at or calling for, even in fact if it's an option that works. And so I suppose really what I'm trying to do is to look at what's real and what's not around the figures. I mean, I think it's important to say to begin with when we're looking at this, because obviously I'm talking about gangs as well, but 90% of crime inside of our society is actually committed by adults. Yeah, that's a really important thing for us to remember actually. Of course, the questions around youth crime always invoke a high level of sort of moral panic, if you like, because it almost questions whether or not there's a breakdown in society of morals, of morality, if what young people are showing us is that our society has become broken. And I think that's why we need to try and look behind the headlines a bit. The issue of gangs, again, it's a phenomenon that's received a lot of attention. It's very ill-defined and ill-thought through. I mean, I don't know whether people would have seen recently the programme that was on Little Boy Blue, which was about the murder of Rhys Jones in Everton, 11-year-old boy who got caught in a crossfire of inter-gang rivalry on Merseyside. Again, when we're talking about gangs and young people that we might call gang-affected, for example, I think it's important. I mean, the estimate, and I don't quite know how they estimate these figures because these statistics, but around 2.5% of the youth population that are actually involved in and around gang activity, which means 97.5% of young people aren't, which I think is quite an important thing for us to remember. I mean, obviously we are going to be looking at that stuff because it's hitting the headlines and because it's important for us to understand it, and what that 2.5% also tells us is some other things about what is taking place for young people across society. And like when the speaker introduced me, my interest in this, of course, is that I'm a youth justice worker, but just important to tell you, it's not going to be today just anecdotal in terms of my experiences or anecdotes or stories about individual young people. This is about an attempt to understand it in a broader range. I think first thing to say is I don't know whether people have seen the articles in The Guardian called Beyond the Blade. If you haven't, please look it up. I'm really grateful to Gary Young, who's a journalist who wrote the book A Day in the Death of America, looking at one day in America and all of the young people and children that were killed by gun crime in America. It's him and another journalist called Damien Gale who have looked at and created a project called Beyond the Blade. And you know, one of the reasons why they've done it is because obviously the figure I gave you earlier from the Evening Standard, which was 24 young people under the age of 25 being killed by knife crime, the reason why that Gary Young and Damien Gale have done this is because actually, even though there are national statistics that are taken around the numbers of young people affected and killed or killed by knife crime, those figures are never released. They're not shown to us. We don't actually know the actual figures from the Home Office or from the Office of National Statistics or any of things. Those things, they're not actually released. And so what Gary Young and Damien Gale are trying to do is to document this year alone the numbers of young people that have been killed. They look at children, young people pretty much under the age of 19. They have a current tally of 21 children and young people. 11 of those are in London. The victims actually range from a newborn baby, a 16-year-old girl, a 5-year-old girl, a 7-year-old boy, a range of teenage boys, actually a range of people from white backgrounds, black backgrounds, Asian backgrounds, and I think that is an important thing to note. And I'm going to come on to the question of race a little bit later, but clearly there are some measures somewhere, because the government is saying at the moment on the basis of their quarterly statistics that knife crime in England and Wales has increased 11% on the previous year, and also the National Health Service is showing that there's been a 13% rise on admissions through knife wounds. The Metropolitan Police also reported last month, they indicated that between 2014 and 2016, the number of children carrying knives into school had risen by 50%, while the number of knife offences has risen by 26%. The problem is we don't know actually where they've started to measure from. So when we say it's gone up by 50%, from what to what? Again, I think sometimes there's a deliberate obfuscation around these sorts of figures, because the fear of crime is actually quite a key thing in terms of government formation of policy and so on. The other side of it is that what it also reflects is that there has been an increased level of awareness around knife possession. Certainly within schools there's been an increased level of awareness, and therefore again, how you understand and interpret statistics I think can be quite difficult on this. The figures actually would suggest that there has been an increase of knife crime back to the figures that we had in 2011. And again, I want to just highlight that, because it's not the case that since we started to record this stuff, or since we started to look at it, that there's been an upward formative trajectory of knife offences. Actually, they go up and they go down. So we've had a dip from 2011, and it's now coming back up 6 years later to where we are now. However, I don't think we can ignore the fact that not just the police, but the National Health Service and schools actually say that there has been a rise in this. And, you know, I suppose there's another side of this, which is that one of the interviews that the Beyond the Blade project did was with a number of trauma surgeons in the hospitals across London. And one of the things that the trauma surgeons are saying is that they're actually getting much better now at dealing with knife wounds, and actually they're saving more lives. Of course, it's the fatalities that hit the headlines in terms of our understandings around knife crime, and actually where the surgeons are getting better at that can also have an impact on the statistics and the figures. At King's College, they say 25% of trauma wounds they have are through stabbings. And I don't know whether people are aware of this or not, but in the Royal London Hospital, on the trauma unit there are now permanent gangs workers who are based at the Royal London Trauma Unit to actually help to try and talk to young people who come in with these types of wounds, to talk about their way out of gang life and so on and so forth. I mean, I suppose again, therefore I think we do have to take that seriously, but I think we have to be actually quite wary as well around how the media reports this, because they have a very haphazard approach to it. Leon Weeks actually was a 16-year-old girl who was stabbed to death in South Yorkshire. Her murder actually attracted 27 mentions in the national press. The 7-year-old girl who was stabbed in York had 68 mentions in the national press. A 15-year-old boy, Kamari Serenkuma Barnes, this young man here, actually only got 3 mentions inside the national press. And I think that's very important to note. There are 2 things about that, actually. Firstly, that the ethnicity of the victim clearly has a massive impact in terms of how things are reported. If the victim is white or if the victim is female, the term knife crime isn't used. Categorically, and you look at any form of national press, they don't use that term. The term knife crime is only used when the victim is a young black man. And I think that's something which is very important for us to look at, because the racism that affects these young people in their deaths is also the racism that affects these young people in their lives as well. And I think that's something very important for us to bear in mind. And even in London, where this year, for example, 11 victims this year of knife crime have all been young black men, actually race isn't really the biggest indicator. It isn't really an indicator at all, in fact, to tell us anything about knife crime and so on as well. Because all of the studies that are done around street crime, around street violence, actually show that once you look at economic and social factors, then race and ethnicity actually have no significance in terms of telling us about who commits crimes and who carries knives and who does these sorts of things. In truth, crime is far more prevalent in poor areas than rich. And actually, due to the institutional racism that exists within our society, both black and minority ethnic people are disproportionately represented in poor areas and disproportionately affected by poverty. And that's just not me just saying that. Here at Marxism, the Youth Justice Board in its own studies, criminologists who carry out research for the Youth Justice Board actually say that class, not race or culture, is a defining issue when we want to understand crime and so on. So when we took everything else into account, ethnicity dropped out of the model altogether in terms of us being able to predict or understand who commits these crimes and so on. And I think that's important because we've had actually people like David Cameron, Tony Blair, a whole number of these politicians who've attempted to really lay the blame for this at the door of what they used to call black on black crime or black people, or they've also talked about blaming it on rap music, on computer games. There's a whole number of ways in which they want us to try and understand how this type of crime takes place. None of which actually gives us any indication or tells us anything about it whatsoever. I actually would argue that culture reflects society, not creates it. That's actually what takes place with that. And of course, the moral panic around this isn't new. You know, for decades now, when you think about actually how young people have been spoken about and dealt with, from the mods and the rockers, who, by the way, were very adept at carrying knives. I mean, people want to watch Quadrophenia or whatever. Knives were a big part of that type of youth culture. Youth cultures, as they've come through and emerged, punks, whichever one you want to look at, those cultures have been dismissed actually by a whole new generation of adults and so on, and a whole new generation of politicians. And I think really, therefore, it's a more complex picture, but there has to be a further discussion about this. But political sound bites from right-wing neoliberal politicians are simply really about trying to lay the blame everywhere apart from at their door and at the door of the system itself. The other people who are very often targeted when it comes to trying to blame what's taken place with this is parents. And I think, again, we have to say, parenting inside the United Kingdom hasn't suddenly become worse over the last few decades or over the last 10 years or something. Actually, the pressure on families and so on through poverty, the pressure on them has actually increased massively. And again, I think here the discussion around class is instructive for us, because the last 3 decades have seen a massive increase in inequality inside of our society, and the age of neoliberalism, culminating in the financial crash that took place 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago now, has actually culminated in a politically motivated policy of austerity, which I actually think has had massively devastating results for the most vulnerable young people inside of our society and for the poorest people inside of our society as well. Youth services especially have been massively hit through austerity, and that's not going to be any news to people, but my union, Unison, for example, has shown how in the last 6 years, I think it's up until 2016, actually things have progressed since then, but there's been 387 million slashed from youth services, about 600 plus youth clubs around the nation that have shut down. The cut in the numbers of youth workers has been 48% cut of youth workers across local authorities across the UK. In London alone, 36 youth centres have been shut, and this is going to increase. This young here, Kumari, who used to go to a youth club in northwest London, they are now facing closure. They can't afford the rent there anymore, and therefore that youth centre will no longer be available to young people. And I think we have to ask the question then: where would you go if you were a young person? I mean, so many parts of society are shut down to you that you can't access, that you can't go to. You're either on the street or you are at home. And in actual fact, I think that's increased massively the tensions for young people. Many of whom say, if you talk to any young person in terms of surveys and so on, about why they might carry a knife, actually they say it's because they're scared out on the streets and because they want to protect themselves. It's a misguided notion. It doesn't lead to anybody's protection at all. Actually, more often than not, it leads to you being hurt, actually, rather than being able to protect yourself. But nevertheless, it's that source of fear that they have, the reasons that they quote for why they carry a knife out on the streets. And I think really as well, there's also a question around gang-related crime, some of our urban areas, which I'm going to come on to in a minute, which I think has also had an impact on that. But I think it's fair to say that this is related to poverty and to austerity. It's not that poverty and austerity have created knife crime, but they have certainly exacerbated it, and I think it's certainly fed into criminality as well. And this is where I want to start to look at gangs, because again, there's been lots of different programmes on this year, whether it's been the Met Police programmes that people might have seen. I'm sorry, this is very London-centric, but it's mainly out sort of urban areas, inner city areas and so on that they tend to report on. Lots of things showing young people in hoodies and masked up and balaclavas, all this sort of stuff, and being interviewed and so on as well. And I want to look at really the issues around gangs. I want to relate it to poverty, because one of the things about gangs is this is not just obviously we're talking about the UK at the moment, but actually gangs exist worldwide. In fact, people probably know that anyway. People look at the United States and all sorts of different models, but one of the programmes which I sort of watched at in the run-up to this was the programme that Ross Kemp did on gangs, where he travels around various different parts of the globe, United States, Mexico, Eastern Europe and so on, and looks at that. And one of the things that Ross Kemp says about it is that he says, what I have learned, the wider the gap between rich and poor and the more poverty a country has, the worse the gang problem will be. Gangs spring up when social structures have been destroyed. And I think that's actually pretty much true in terms of the experience that I've got, in terms of the research that we've looked at. They occupy that space within society in terms of people attempting to try and make money in some way, shape or form. And again then, when we try and define a gang, I want to try and give it a bit of a definition, because clearly some of the fear and some of the issues that have been raised around gangs means that sometimes people will see just a group of young people standing on a street corner and all of a sudden they're labelled as a gang. Actually, I wouldn't define that as a gang. That's a peer group, really, a group of young people just hanging out with each other. That's not what I would say that we would look to if we're looking for a gang. I think really we have to say that a gang has to be involved in some sort of criminal activity, some sort of illegitimate business, if you want to use another term, which I think actually helps to explain and describe where gangs come from, and inevitably that involves violence within it as well. And I think criminality and violence are a key factor around gangs. And really they're about making money. And one of the things I want to talk about here is when we talk about crime, when we talk about criminality, we're talking about something which is defined by the state, and something which is therefore not neutral in any way, shape or form. Because in actual fact, who makes the laws? Who decide who is pursued in criminal terms and who's not? The levels of corporate crime, the levels of white collar crime that exist within our society are way more costly in actual fact to us as taxpayers, normal citizens, or whatever you want to call it, than actually the criminals that are pursued by the police and those that we're looking at certainly in our talk here in terms of young people. Also, I think it's important to say that crime has changed because I don't know if people remember the jewellery heist in Hatton Garden. That was actually quite an unusual crime for us to see, because those types of crimes now have really got into the background. I think it's important to say that capitalism itself actually shapes crime in quite an interesting way. I mean, clearly, when we look at things like online frauds and crime, I mean, 27 billion in actual fact stolen through online fraud and online crime, that's without doubt shaped by the productive development within capitalism itself. I also want to look at who is called a criminal and who isn't, because clearly, you know, when we think about those people who are responsible for the Grenfell disaster, not one of those people has been hauled in front of a judge and either remanded or bailed or anything like that at all. And I would say those people massively have criminal responsibility for what took place there. And I just want to put those things out there, because in terms of how we understand what crime and criminality is, we have to understand that it's also shaped very much by the class system that we live in, and who makes the rules and who decides. Clearly what we're talking about here, though, is street crime. And it isn't to remove responsibility from people who do commit crimes, but I think it's important to say that although those people do choose to act in that way, they do so not under conditions of their own choosing. And I think that's a very important thing to remember for all the young people that I work with. The conditions that actually lead them towards committing crime or being involved in gangs or gang affiliated or so on and so forth are certainly not conditions of their making at all. Worldwide, we see that class and poverty underlie massively the vast majority of gang activity. And again, those gangs are shaped by the societies which they come from. If you want to look at the United States, for example, we see you know, the demographics, the changing nature of populations also changes how gangs are. We can't just define it on the grounds of race, for example. American society is obviously much more segregated than British society and so on. And of course, you know, you have the traditional view of the gang as the Bloods and the Crips and so on, and black people. Actually, when you start to see the rise of Latino communities and so on, you start to see the rise of Latino gangs. In other words, it reflects the communities in which they come from, and therefore you can't just define it on the grounds of race. I think capitalism has massively shaped gangs. I mean, to be honest with you, gangs existed prior to capitalism. There's talk about gangs going right back to the Roman Empire and so on as well. But clearly here, the access that people have to economic success, to economic opportunity is the key thing. I don't know if people saw the Scorsese film, Gangs of New York, for example, that looks at the rise of Irish-American gangs at the time. In truth, what you start to see, though, if you start to look at the patterns of street gangs and so on, actually when you see a massive expansion of the American economy following on from the Second World War, you see a massive decline in the number of street gangs. Then you move forward to the 1980s, where you have massive deindustrialisation inside of these societies, and then you start to see the rise of the street gang again. In other words, it is without doubt linked to the economic opportunities and the access that people have towards that. The increase and the proliferation of drugs and opiates is especially important for us to see here as well. Certainly when you think about the 1980s, and the 1980s is important for us because it is the beginnings really of neoliberal policies where Reaganomics and Thatcher and so on, we actually see in America the war on drugs and so on and so forth. Actually, the economic policies that were brought into neoliberalism have had a huge and devastating impact on working class communities. And it's the same here in the UK. In the 1980s, we start to see teenage peer groups in the deindustrialised regions actually becoming involved in the use and distribution of opiates. In the northeast, in Wales, in the Midlands, actually where young people would have gone into jobs in steel, mining, whatever manufacturing industry you had in those areas, when that industry becomes shut down, actually people's ability to make a living for themselves is severely hampered, and that's when you start to see, again, the rise of drug use and opiates in terms of sales, and also in terms of obviously the escape that provides. And just as gangs are a response to inequality under capitalism, they also reflect capitalism. They have, just like you have a hierarchy in legitimate business, you have a hierarchy in illegitimate business as well. In fact, I mean, there's a book called Freakonomics, which I think the first one of Freakonomics, there's a very interesting little study in there on a Chicago-based crack gang, where the researchers who are doing sort of PhDs around or whatever get access to the account books of this Chicago-based crack gang, and also interview a whole number of people within that gang. Really what they conclude is that the closest model in terms of how the gang structures itself would be McDonald's, for example, if you wanted to see as to where they really match and where they really fit. And of course, if you're a young person in that, you're the burger flipper, yeah, let's be clear that. You're the cleaning the toilets, this is your little role inside of this, again, which is important to remember. Because actually it's very similar for gangs here, and even though what we see and what is promoted to us as gangs is these young people, the roadmen, the little shotters, the boys that are out on the streets and selling and so on, you know, it's very different from actually the picture that we're given about the craze in the 1960s. We're almost given a very romanticised model about these people, as if somehow they had a code of criminality and some sort of morality about them. In actual fact, most people who are involved in these gangs still are related and originate back to these same people. These are the people that aren't seen, the people that are at the top of the gang structure. In between of them, you have mediators who are sort of street-based and so on, or the youngers, or they might be called, or they've got the elders at the very top, the youngers, then the soldiers or the shotters. There's all sorts of different names, and of course, depending on where you come from, depends on what you'll be called and what term you might use to identify yourself. But nevertheless, there is quite clearly a hierarchy that exists within those gangs. And also, of course, when you are involved in this type of money making, there are inevitable consequences to that. Because if your customers don't pay you, you don't take them to small claims court to recoup your money. There has to be the threat of violence and violence involved within that as well. And at the same time, if you want to expand your market, you're going to come up against other gangs in that area. And of course, just like there are acquisitions and mergers within legitimate business, there's acquisitions and mergers within illegitimate business as well at the same time. What I also think has happened, though, is that the government strategy and the policing strategy has actually increased the levels of violence on the street, and I think that's important to recognise. And that's not just something that I would say, but when you talk to or you read ex-police officers very disillusioned with the system and the way in which the things like the drugs trade and so on have been approached and drugs crime, actually what they will talk about is the fact that really what they go for is the low-hanging fruit. They go for the young guys that are out on the streets. They're not going for the people at the top of these gangs. That I think requires that's probably a bigger thing around what corruption exists and so on, and actually how the state and big criminals work together in a whole number of ways. But actually, what therefore happens is that the people that are targeted are the young people on the ground. And in terms of actually how the elders in gangs actually respond to that, really what they want is they want for their boys on the ground to be more frightened of them than they are of the police, because otherwise they're likely to give away stuff and so on. And therefore the inter-gang violence, the violence that is used within gangs on actually some of these younger people has massively escalated, and I think has escalated dramatically the use of knives and so on within those circles. I think then the question about exploitation of these young people is absolutely huge. And I suppose it raises the question as to why you would join a gang if that's the case. I'm going to come on to that in a second. But actually, these disaffected young people, excluded from school by and large, who actually feel they have very little opportunity in life, full stop, actually are hit by a double whammy. Not only are they targeted by criminal gangs to be, their runners and so on, they're also targeted by the police on the streets at the same time. And again, this whole question as to whether or not we should just now reintroduce stop and search, I think we have to remember one thing very, very clearly. The levels of racism that are still involved with the police are massive. You're still 4 or 5 times more likely to be stopped as a young black man in London than if you're white. And yet we know that ethnicity is not the key, actually, to understanding knife crime or understanding crime in general or in fact gangs. So I think racism, we have to say, is a big part of the mismatch of actually who is looked for and actually how these things take place. The other thing I want to just come on to very quickly and look at is the question of girls within gangs, because there's been a whole range of different studies that have come out around this that look at the levels of exploitation that girls face. Of course, there are some rare occasions in which you have women, young women who might be higher up within a gang's hierarchy, but by and large, actually they are exploited in the same way that the young men are. Sexism is real in our society. Sexism is also real inside of gang culture. And I suppose in some ways, if you want to try and describe it, people say that power corrupts, but powerlessness corrupts absolutely in terms of actually how people treat each other in these sort of circumstances. So it's without question that sexual violence is used as a way of disciplining girls and young women who are involved in gangs. In actual fact, I think it's important, though, to point out that for young women across the board, actually, whether you are poor, working class, and so on, or whether or not you are going to university, levels of sexism and sexual harassment and sexual violence have increased massively anyway. And therefore, what I'm saying is that there's going to be an outcry over sexism and the way in which sexual violence is used with women. It can't just be an outcry for those at the base of society. This is happening across the board that this takes place. So again, the question then, of course, is then why would people join? And of course, when we look at poverty, alienation, lack of resources, school exclusions, and so on, I suppose there's the question of how do we deal with this? And working in youth justice, I can see actually sometimes what they try and promote as the answer is that actually we increase sentencing, we put more young people into prison, and we have tougher policing. I don't think that we can say, considering what we know about youth detention, which is that 85% at least come out to re-offend, we cannot say in any way, shape or form that youth detention works. It just doesn't work. It doesn't rehabilitate anybody. It doesn't stop anybody from re-offending at all. And also, I think we have to say that there are actually terrible conditions inside our youth offenders institutions at the moment. I mean, Feltham, of course, is the most notorious in London. In actual fact, a young person, a 16-year-old young boy, has just recently won a case against the government around his human rights because he was locked up for 23 hours a day. Right? This is a regular occurrence inside of YOIs in England and Wales. 40% of those young people there are locked up during the school day. 30% only have 2 hours out of the day, out of their cells in a day. In my opinion, youth detention and Feltham places, they should be shut. They should be closed. They're not fit for purpose. They don't create anything other than further problems for our young people. And it's also a waste of money, and it serves an ideological role. And I want to give you an example for this. In 2011, when the riots took place after the shooting of an innocent man in Tottenham, actually there was a boy who was given a 3-month sentence for stealing a bottle of water. At the same time as those riots were taking place, there was also, what happened that year, was the stuff around the MPs' expenses. MPs were allowed to pay their expenses back. Right? This boy was put in Feltham for 3 months, and it would have cost £15,000 approximately to put him inside of Feltham for 3 months. And the thing that we do know is from the London School of Economics, when they did the study on the riots of 2011, one of the reasons, obviously, apart from the trigger point, which was the racist policing and the oppressive policing that young people face on a daily basis, was actually the scrapping of the education maintenance allowance. That's one of the key factors about why they rioted. And it does beg the question, if you can spend £15,000 on putting somebody inside for 3 months, why can't you spend £15,000 on their education in the first place? Half of all 15 to 17-year-olds in custody have literacy levels of 7 to 11-year-olds. 9 out of 10 have been excluded from schools. And I think we have to therefore say that our education system is failing our young people in that respect. And I think we have to call for an end to league tables, to school exclusions, and we have to call for some serious investment into our schools. Actually, where do most politicians who make the decisions about our schools send their kids? To private schools, where they have small class sizes, where they have massive resources. All of our children could flourish in those circumstances, and I don't think we should accept anything less than that for all children inside of our society. Actually, we have, according to many surveys, some of the most unhappy children and young people in Europe. They're the most tested and the subject of the most regimented regimes. 160,000 children are prescribed antidepressants each year inside this country. It's a shocking figure considering the decimation of mental health services that go to young people as well. The other thing which I think we should then call for is for a massive investment in mental health services for young people and a massive investment in youth services. The other thing which I think would make quite a big difference here in terms of youth crime and so on as well would be the decriminalisation of drugs. There's no evidence anywhere in the country, in any other countries, that it's increasing use, and actually I think it would be a massive help. The final thing that I'm going to finish up on is I think what's important to acknowledge, following on from Corbyn's election, general election and the vote that happened around that, is that I think it tells us two things. One, that actually we can put forward some very serious reforms now for actually what would have an impact on young people in this country. It has smashed the neoliberal consensus and the idea that the welfare state is a problem, and I think therefore these are things that we actually have to start calling for. The second thing it tells us is that young people can and will engage in politics inside of our society when they feel inspired and when they feel there's a possibility for change. I think we should lower the age of voting down to 16. Personally, I think that would draw a lot more young people and get them much more involved in stuff as well, and I think they should, if you can join the army at 16, you should be able to bloody well vote at the age of 16 as well. And I suppose really, when we talk about the inspiration for real change, I think we have to say that we really have to fight, not just for those reforms, but I think we have to fight against a system where it's just totally dependent upon economic, social and political inequality to survive. And I'll leave it there for discussion. Thank you.
Hello, basically I'm a fitness instructor. My first job, it was involving a secondary school that was a sports school, and I worked there as an instructor. The school basically had a fitness suite for kids to come a couple of hours after school, and then after that would be the public come into the gym. But unfortunately, I was working there from I think 2008, but by 2011, I think 10 years, the government came in, the Tories. By 2011, gym closed down. You know, so, but because it closed down for the public, but because my heart was so much rather in that the kids would, you know, when I got laid off of the job in 2011, the kids in that secondary school, they wanted me to stay at the job. They didn't want me to go. And I volunteered working there for 3 years because I thought I'd rather they be here after school for a couple of hours than be on the street. So I did that until the government changed the school name and the fitness suite was just closed, not even for them. And I totally do agree that the youth clubs, that would really, really make a difference. And that really upset me when the Tories just cut. And that was an example right there. But I worked there because I was even a victim of the cut. But I did 3 years volunteering, working with them. And another thing I want to mention is as well, I've been a victim this year at 2011. In March 29, I meant to say. I was on a tram in Croydon because I'm from South London. And loads of young people were on the tram. And there was a girl, found out later on that she's 16 years old, though she looked like she was 19. And 2 guys with her were carrying bottles of alcohol, 10 at night. And the girl tried to rob me. Because I had a hold of my wallet and I didn't let her get it, she punched up my eye and I'm on the floor. And loads of other kids were all scattered on the tram, looked like they were high. And when they ran off the tram, and what happened was when the doors were closing, one girl who's further up the tram earlier before they ran on when the doors were closing, grabbed someone's bag and ran off. So you can tell that this was a gang, and not only a gang, they're professional thieves. Now, I know I spent my childhood in New York, though I was born here, and one of the things I do notice, I believe, a lot of them come from backgrounds where single parents, they don't have a dad, and also come from low income. I understand, because I grew up in the projects of New York as well. A lot of the drug dealers, all of that. But I really, really do desire that the youth clubs will come back, there will be money for that. Because I do believe, because I remember being a child, not having nowhere to go. Having places for them to go, instead of being out on the street, and not, you know, the money matches, that would really, really make a difference. Okay?
Yeah, comrades. I work in the same local authority as Joe, and I also work with children's services, and we sometimes have the same clients and stuff in the youth justice system. I'm also the father of a 17-year-old son, and actually I understand the fears and anxieties of parents, and when you look at knife crime and the hoo-ha around it. I often stay out quite late, small hours in the morning, waiting for my son to come back from parties, and you breathe a sigh of relief and all of that stuff. But actually, what's really important to understand is what Joe said, is actually 2.5%, it's only 2.5% of young people who are actually actively involved in what we would call gang culture and stuff. And I think we need to put things in perspective. Before the meeting, I hastily printed off a load of stuff about the causes of death amongst different age groups. And actually, the biggest killer of 16 to 24-year-olds in this country is still road crime. It's still road accidents and road incidents, you know. And actually, the biggest argument I have with my 17-year-old son is not about where he goes or where he stays. Actually, he's a cyclist. Wear a bloody helmet and put some lights on at night, you know. So I think we need to make sure that we see it and stuff like that. But really, what's really worrying when you look at sort of trends, actually, more and more young people in their 20s are dying because of self-harm, because of suicide, self-harm, and things like that, you know. And I have been working with young people for 20-odd years, and actually, there's always been an element of mental health within that work. But actually now, I actually work, a large proportion of my work is working with young people who we call schoolophobic. That was a sort of jokey term, but actually it's become a serious term for young people who cannot take the rigours of school life. Young people who actually suffer from deep anxiety and depression and actually can't face the school system and have to be educated separately. And we're seeing that actually, if you want to chart the rise of knife crime in this country, you can chart it back to one piece of legislation, the 1988 Tory Education Act. Because what that did, it brought in league tables, it brought in stuff, and when that came in, the number of fixed-term exclusions for young people absolutely rocketed. And when we look at fixed-term exclusions and the risk attached to them, we can see that actually young people who are excluded from school are more likely to carry knives, particularly the boys, but the young girls as well are more likely to become victims of sexual exploitation, you know. So we've seen all this, and this is why what Joe said is really, really important about actually linking the fight against austerity and linking the fight, you know, against knife crime and youth violence, because actually young people, if they've got no hope, if they don't think they're going to be able to get a job, if young people are thrown out on the streets, if young people can be victims to all sorts of things, you know, and I think it's really important for us as socialists to say we need to put these things in perspective, but it's also to say that there's a different way, and actually if we want to fight for young people's futures, we need to change society, and we need to change it on a socialist basis, because actually the rich and capitalism is all about creating competition, and when we see competition, that goes, you know, competition in its highest form takes on military bands, and if it's all right for our rulers to kill and maim, young people are going to think exactly the same. So actually we need to show them a different way.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to be saying a lot of the same things. I live just up the road from Kamari Bays, so his death actually affected us, because a lot of the people I work with, I'm a teacher in the school I work with, actually had worked with him, and their kids had grown up alongside him. And in our community, he sent a lot of ripples out, actually. It wasn't an unusual thing. There's quite a lot of knife crimes, and there was another boy killed a couple of months before on the same estate, which really didn't hit the press in the same way at all, and was much quieter, but also affected the people I work with because they'd known him as a little boy. I think, you know, all the things that people have said about the way the cuts have affected areas like where I live in Brent are absolutely true. But the other thing that I think we have to throw into the mix here is we had all these vicious cuts from the Tory government, but actually the Labour Council in Brent has been bloody useless at tackling any of them. The problems of housing are extreme. We're only a few couple of miles away from Grenfell. We see a lot of the same conditions inside our borough as well that affect Grenfell, because the Labour Council hasn't fought for it. They've allowed the sell-off. They've transferred estates out into these arms length companies and allowed them to, you know, so there's no regulation of the safety in them. At the moment, for CAMS, I know because my son's been seen by CAMS, that's the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. There's a 2-year waiting list now. So if you're facing a serious mental health problem, forget it. You're going to sit for 2 years, getting worse and worse, and self-harming possibly, and possibly facing suicide. It's even difficult to get an emergency appointment for children that are actually, you know, suicidal. It's shocking. Actually, I know I shouldn't say this because it's actually not out in the public realm yet, but I know that our social care in our borough has just been slated by Ofsted because they don't help families that need help. Personally, I work with families of children with disabilities. We've gone from being able to get several hours a week of respite care for those families, particularly the single parents who are dealing with children with, you know, severe autism, things like conditions like that, to now the best I've managed to get this year is 2 hours. I'm going begging cap in hand to charities at the moment to help families that are at breaking point because of their children's disabilities. And the council again and again, you know, say, oh, but we've been cut. And I think that, you know, for me, one of the biggest things that we can do as socialists is actually start to say that we need to see a fight inside these areas. You know, we can't take these cuts lying down, we can't just blame it on the Tories. I actually want to see Labour councils setting deficit budgets and saying, no, actually our kids, you know, we've got as you said, Joe, we haven't got any youth centres open anymore. They are all being cut. There's nowhere for those kids to go. There's severe overcrowding on all the estates. The kids don't have their own bedrooms to sit in. So where are they going to go? They're on the streets, of course they are. You know, and then they get harassed by the police and they get drawn into all sorts of things. It's not good enough. You know, actually, I'm a school governor as well, and I've told the head of the school that I will not sit on any panels of permanent exclusion because I don't think it's the answer. I'd rather you keep those difficult kids in the school and deal with it somehow than have them out on the streets getting into all sorts of trouble. And that was something that a lot of people supported on that governing board, I'm glad to say. But yeah, leave it there.
So you first. You don't want to be on film. That's okay, just do it here. Is that okay?
I agree with everything that's been said, but if you live in an area where you have got gang violence, it's crap. And so what you're actually going to do, the people who are suffering from it, the neighbours, the relatives, the people who... I'll just go on for a couple of minutes. So I grew up in an area in Bristol called St Paul's. There's a lot of gang activity there. My next door neighbour's kid that we grew up, one of his sons got murdered. Churchy people and hard-working people, he got involved in crime, so he doesn't fit the stereotype of the single mum, the shitty house and all the rest of it. He grew up in a nice house. And so I know someone else who's got been done for murder. He's since dead. Someone else whose sons who've been doing 18 years because they killed somebody in a nightclub. So these things do go on, and the rest of the people who live in those areas are getting sucked into shit. They are making life, the gangs are making life hell for people who live in those areas. In fact, a lot of people in St Paul's were actually happy when crack came around because it meant youngsters weren't going around burgling and mugging. So I agree with everything you said about the big concept of clearing up crime, but if you live in crime-ridden areas, it's still hell. There's a thing in America they talk about called white flight, where white people leave poor areas because of the influx of black people or crime or whatever. What you've got in St Paul's and Easton, in Bristol, is black flight, where people who are working hard to do whatever they do in their lives just want to get away from people who are living corrupt lives. That's it, thank you.
Okay, well, I work as a solicitor and I specialise in youth crime. And so I represent children. And let me start off by saying there's two things, firstly, to say about this. Firstly, about crime and the increase in crime. There's always been knives, there's always been crime through the whole of capitalist society. I mean, maybe I'm unusual. My dad carried a knife. His brothers carried knives in the 1930s. When I was at school, he gave me a knife to carry to keep myself safe. What has changed in society is the criminalisation of children and of the children that I represent. We have an age of criminal responsibility in this country of 10. So from the age of 10, you can be arrested by the police, you can be detained in a police cell, and you can end up in court for things. And most of the people I represent are children. They're not, I mean, the example Joe's given about, youngers and the gang stuff, this is a tiny minority. The people who we're reading about in the papers, whose names aren't mentioned, who we're being told are these young people who are in gangs, they speak to me about being in gangs. They're scared, and so they are with groups of friends in the area they live with because they're scared if they see someone down the road who they don't know, they'll attack each other. And so that's what it's about. And just to say, the age of criminal responsibility, 10, utterly ridiculous. Let me just tell you this, 80% of children who get taken to the police station have severe communication and language difficulties. This is one of the things that we're not told about these young people. They are out of education, not because they're truants and because they're bad, not because they're stupid. They cannot work in those schools because these needs are not identified at a young enough age. And these are the children that end up in the police station, where quite frankly they're treated appallingly. The police treat their parents like they're scum. It's generally the mothers that they blame. They say things to me like, oh, his mum's not coming to the police station, she doesn't get up till 3 in the afternoon. And I said, well, that's because she's a night worker, isn't it? You know, this whole thing about the parents are responsible for it comes from the police. They go through a foul youth justice system where they go to court. If you're an adult and you go to court and I represent you, I speak to the judge. If you're a youth, a child, if you're 13 or 14 and you're in court with me, you have to stand up and say why you did it. You have to say you're sorry. You have to explain remorse. You have to speak in court. Adults don't have to do this. The lawyer does it for them. They are treated entirely differently. They are still put in the Crown Court at ages of 15 and 16. I was at the Crown Court last week, sorry to be anecdotal, with a 15 and 16-year-old, where the 16-year-old was self-harming in the court. He was hitting his head on the wall. We made a very simple request with the psychologist that they took off wigs and gowns. The judge would have none of it. And the prosecutor said, if he's old enough to wave a hammer, he's old enough to sit in front of a wig and gown. They are not treated like what they are, children and vulnerable children, and people that we criminalise. And I do want to say, and it is true, most young people don't do these things. And the other hugely overrepresented people in the young people in the criminal justice system are looked after children. What a term that is, looked after. Who looks after them? When they go to court, they're children who are taken away from their parents, put in care from foster parents, I'm not denigrating foster parents, put in children's homes. In a children's home, you get the strop, knock the paper over, squirt ketchup up a fridge. My kid does that. We have a fight, it's over, whatever, he's grounded. I represent them in court again and again. Criminal damage for squirting ketchup. You get young people with huge criminal records for this constant way of doing things. And if they can't get them in the criminal justice system through this, they're brought in by something called criminal behaviour orders, which is the old anti-social behaviour order. So they decide that hanging around on the street with your mates, they'll make it a criminal offence. They make an order against you for 2 or 3 years. You're with Danny, who's your mate, you're not supposed to be. Criminal offence and big criminal records. And I can understand why young people feel when they come from some of the. I'll be honest, I can appreciate the guy who said, you know, it's bad in your streets if you've got these young people behaving like that. But we have to see them what they are, as vulnerable young people and children. We have to engage with them in some way, and we certainly don't do it by criminalising them and taking them away from their families and destroying. When I look at them and I look at the potential, my one last bugbear is the education system on this. Once they go into places like Feltham, these children who've struggled at school, and this is why they've truanted, who've got needs that aren't picked up on those levels, are then tried to be forced through this maths, English, whatever GCSEs, you want me to shut up, yeah? System, where they've got huge talents over a range of things, but there's no outlet for them to be trained in the things they can do, things I think they should do. Some of them who nick mopeds, all right, they shouldn't nick mopeds, but they are brilliant with engines. They could be trained to be mechanics. They've got potential to do things. They're our next generation, and the system is totally criminalising them and destroying their lives.
I think I'll get 3 more speakers in if we go down to 2 minutes.
2 minutes, yeah, okay. I shall do my best. I just want to share with you an experience. I'm a psychiatric nurse. I prefer to call myself a mental health nurse these days. A psychiatric's quite an old term, but you know what's in a name. I think the second or third ward that I worked on was a forensic adolescent psychiatric unit, which is, you know, forensic. The people there are actually locked in adolescent. They were 14 to 18, so children. They were all nearly all coming from the young offenders units, and the vast majority of the young sort of people we were working with, it was stress related because they can't deal with the hierarchy, as I think the gentleman mentioned there. It's really difficult when you're in a situation where you're told you have to climb above other people to be in a position where you can actually you're going to improve your lot, but it's at the expense of the people below you. So we were seeing a lot of self-harm, etc. But what I'd like to tell you about, which I think is quite positive, we very rarely use medication very rarely use medication. On the ward there was doctors, support workers and nurses, and it's extremely rare that we use any antipsychotics, antidepressants, Ritalin, anything like that. What we did do is we had a community. All the staff that worked on the unit understood that the young people that were coming in needed to be cared for, because what they were doing to themselves wasn't any fault of their own, and that's what you're trying to show them, that people do care. So they would come in through the front door, get locked in, and they were angry and aggressive and would fight the world. Give it about 3 or 4 weeks, when they realised that the adults there who actually cared for them wanted to support them and listen to them non-judgmentally and kind of offer them a bit of support and a bit of realistic advice, they generally turn around and they accept that. And I'm happy to say that the vast majority, probably over 90% of the people I work with, when they left in a better place than when they arrived. That is the importance of context and the importance of material conditions. One of the, I think, material conditions that we need to get right is community and family. So let's get rid of poverty so we can have those to start off with a more fair society. Thank you.
So we've got 2 more speakers in this section. Sorry to everybody else.
I think it's absolutely barbaric what the conditions that our children are being subjected to. And the woman who spoke about the criminalization of youth, I want to just talk about the pathologization of them as well as being mentally ill. Because my experience is in the Canadian system, and the Canadian school system is such that there's been, similarly to here, cutback after cutback after cutback. All the things that used to make school fun when I went to school in the 60s and early 70s, they're gone now. It's regimented, it's standardized, the classrooms are big, it's irrelevant to people's lives for the most part, and very few people flourish. And kids, we have 7 grandchildren, and they tell us that all of their friends are depressed or anxious because they don't see any future, they think the world has gone to shit, they think that the adults don't really care. They're feeling hopeless, angry, desperate, and the language of kids is behavior. They act out or they act in. And in the school system in the Toronto District School Board has cut all of the guidance counselors, all of the people that you could go to and talk to if you were having family problems. And instead what they've done is they've partnered with AstraZeneca, a big pharmaceutical company, to set up programs in the school for early detection of kids who might develop mental illness and to get them on drugs. And this is a substitute for improving conditions in the schools, improving conditions for the families and the communities, is to say you're having, not only just normal adolescent angst, but all of the additional problems of coming into this shitty world, this barbaric world, which adults seem to just accept, which of course we don't. We're seething inside too, but we have better ability to contain it. Kids don't, right? And they need to have people to talk to help them to understand, to listen to them, and instead of being told, you have a disease, your brain is diseased, you're going to have to take drugs for the rest of your life. This then becomes an identity, and it's all about me and my shame and my defect, and there's a lot of money for this, and this is supposedly helping kids with their mental health problems. So we've got to be careful about promoting that.
This is the last speaker in this section. Now I'm going to call forward Liz Wheatley, who's going to talk briefly about the SWP financial appeal. Thanks, Chris. Sorry to everybody else, by the way, who put their hands up.
I just wanted to talk about a few things. One was, people probably wouldn't have heard, there was a case in Stockton in the northeast where I'm from, where 6, it might be more now, people died from a bad batch of heroin. One of the people was from my street, and it didn't make the national news, I think, for 2 reasons. One is that they don't care about the poorest people in society, they don't care about working class people. The other thing is they couldn't use it to whip up some racist myth. It's a predominantly white area, so there was no mileage in saying, look at all these gangs, look at all these black people and so on. So again, it wasn't national news at all, it was just one line. But what I would say is that, just on the issue of gangs, I think there has been times in the past when people who have been gang members have left gangs or become political activists and so on. People might have heard of Tookie Williams, the founder of the Crips in America. When he was on death row, he negotiated peace settlements with gangs and tried to get people to leave. Also the Black Panther Party, people inspired by the Black Panther Party, such as the Lords Gang, became a political group and ceased gang activity. But my point is that people who are in gangs will not listen to the government or the police telling you to leave. They won't listen. If you turn up with the police or you put a poster saying hand in your knives like they do in Tottenham, no one's going to listen to them. The police are the enemy in Tottenham. No one's going to listen to that. So I think it's actually very important that socialists have an answer to fight for a better world, and we can actually win some of these people to leave in the gangs, but also fighting to change their own conditions. Thanks.
Great, thank you, and thanks for everybody who contributed towards the discussion as well. Just to come on to respond to some of those issues. I really don't deny what people are saying about some of the horrors actually that there are in terms of gang violence and so on that exist for people, and some of the horrific crimes that have been committed. It's not about a denial of that. And I do think it's important to look at, and you're talking about some of the issues around some of the estates. And there's something which I think is important to say about this, because obviously I've highlighted a whole number of things which I think need to happen inside of our society in terms of how we respond to what's happening for young people. Social housing, I think, is one aspect that I didn't mention in the first part of it, which I would want to put forward now. And the reason why I want to put that forward is because I think really what Grenfell showed us is not just the fact that there's a total lack of care around working class lives inside of our society, the lack of investment that's gone into social housing in that instance was totally and utterly devastating for people. That's really the tip of the iceberg in some ways, in terms of actually when you look at what's taken place in a whole number of our estates around social housing. And the reason why I think it's important to think back historically is that social housing actually was something which actually lifted the living standards of working class people when it was implemented and brought forward. We had massive housing programmes, actually made a huge difference to people's lives. It made a huge difference in terms of not having outside toilets, for example. It made a huge difference in terms of the spaces that people were able to live in, and actually it lifted everybody's living standards. Where there has been not just the right to buy, but also the change or there's been an encouragement in the change in the idea that if you live in social housing, somehow you're actually at the bottom of the pile. That really the aspiration all the time has to be about ownership of property and all that sort of thing, and that's really the way that people move up in life and so on, is in that way, shape or form. I think we have to reject that, and I think we have to call for some very serious investment in social housing and into our estates and into our communities, because I think it can make a big difference to people's lives. And when I think now, in London, if you're a young person in London now, your ability to access housing in the future, I just can't imagine really where are people going to live? At this point in time, even when you're a professional, you can't access decent housing in London. Never mind, if you're a young person now just going into college and just getting a job, how you think your future is going to be. And of course it is meaning that there's massive overcrowding for people. If you're a parent, God, the idea of your child living with you into their 20s and into their 30s, I mean, goodness, and my mum and dad are in the audience, I can't imagine how she would have felt having to look after me and my brother until we're in our 30s or something, having us hanging around all the time. Of course they would have done it, but actually that's not what we want for our futures. We want people to be able to move out and become independent. So I think we have to have investment in our estates, in our houses, in social housing, in our communities, and I think that has to be a part of some of our solutions. The other thing, of course, which I think is important in terms of how we're looking at this is that what Claire, the solicitor, talked about young people and Lucy and other people, the mental health workers and so on that come up and spoke, is that what we are encouraged to do is to individualise the problem. The problem is the individual young person, yeah? The problem is the people that are hanging on the estate. The problem is the parent who doesn't do this. The problem is, and all the time what we're encouraged to do is to focus downwards and just look at the individual and never actually to look at the wider context and lay the blame for this at the door of wider society. The criminal age of responsibility, again, it was something else I meant to put in the first thing. I think that should be raised to 14. I think it should be scrapped from being 10. I know 14 might sound random, but actually that's the criminal age of responsibility in a whole number of European countries actually as well. I don't see any reason why it should be 10 in this country. The question of looked after children as well, I actually think it's a very damning indictment of our government that if your parent is the government, if your parent is the local authority, actually you are far more likely to end up in custody. Your educational achievements are going to be very, very low. It doesn't have to be that way. In Denmark, for example, 90% of looked after children go on to go to university. Yeah, it doesn't have to be that way at all for those children. Things can change and things can be better for them. And I suppose finally, really, what I want to look at is that, you know, a lot of the horrors that we talk about, again, it's important that people put this into perspective, isn't it, in terms of actually the minority of people, actually the vast majority of young people muddle through, try and find a way to get into college. I mean, it's interesting now, isn't it, the school leaving age has now been raised to 18 now. Funding for 16 to 18-year-olds in education has been cut by about 25% just in the last few years, never mind what's happened before that. So even though we're telling our young people they've got to stay in education, we're cutting it. And actually the courses that actually a lot of our young people are put onto, actually they feel are very... substandard is not the right word. They don't come out with decent qualifications that get them any decent work at the end of it. As well. So there are huge issues here, which are systemic issues. And I think the bottom line is that the way in which our young people are treated, the way in which children are treated inside of our society, I think we have to say is a damning indictment of capitalism full stop in terms of actually how and what young people are experiencing. I do think that there are massive possibilities for those young people to become a part of a movement. I think the Corbyn stuff shows that. Interestingly, when people talked about gangs suspending rivalries, in 2011, in the riots in 2011, gangs there suspended rivalries with each other. When they went out after the police and so on, actually they suspended rivalries between themselves. And very often they would call the police the largest armed gang on the streets as well. That's actually how they experience policing in this country. And I don't think they're far wrong from that. So I think we have to say the blame doesn't lie with the individuals. That clearly there is a problem and a crisis taking place for some of the young people inside of our society. But unless we try and raise the standards and fight against austerity and say we're not accepting the divisions and the inequality that we experience, I think we can raise the standards for every single child inside this country. And this myth of the government policy called Every Child Matters, which is a policy actually, by the way, that we have currently inside this country, I think we can make it a reality when we fight back against the system with young people for the resources that they so clearly deserve.